Hey, Typology listeners. Before we jump in, I just want to remind you that Ian's new book and workbook is now available for pre-order. It's called The Fix: How the 12 Steps Offer a Surprising Path of Transformation for the Well-Adjusted, the Down and Out, and everyone in between. All of us look for the next fix to help numb and endure the constant emotional, psychological, and spiritual pain that comes from living in a broken world. But in Ian's new book, he demonstrates how anyone can use the 12 steps to overcome repetitive, self-defeating behaviors. Listen, I've read this book. I'm already reading it for the second time. I think it's one of Ian's best works, and I know you're going to love this book. You can pre-order both the Fix and the companion workbook anywhere books are sold, such as Audible, Barnes & Noble, Target, Books A Million, and Amazon. And if you pre-order from Amazon Pre, you'll lock in the lowest price before release, and you won't have to worry about it being out of stock. Simply go to ianmorgancron.com/The Fix to order from your preferred vendor. That's it for me, Anthony Skinner. And now here is the host of the show, Ian Cron.
Hello, Typology friends. Welcome back to the podcast on which we explore the mystery of the human personality and actually the whole human adventure through the lens of the Enneagram. We are joined today by our new friend, Enneagram 3, author of the new book, Learning to Love Midlife, 12 Reasons Why Life Gets Better with Age. Chip Conley, welcome to Typology.
Oh, thank you, Ian. It's great to be here. I'm a longtime fan and follower of the Enneagram.
Oh, man, we're delighted. In fact, we have some mutual friends. We have Richard Rohr is a mutual friend of ours, as is Michael Stainer, who I was with last week, or maybe 10 days ago. I was with Michael, and he had just come from being with you. Like literally like 2 days before, he had been with you at the Modern Elder Academy and teaching. And so what a wonderful serendipitous moment to have you on Typology.
Yeah, no, he was at our Baja campus. We have also a campus where I'm coming from right now in Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Yeah. Well, he told me he had a wonderful, wonderful time with you all. And as I mentioned to you prior to hitting record, I don't always have the luxury of reading the books of the people that come on the show. However, I want people to know that I read several of your books and then had our publicist reach out to you specifically to be on the show. Because I'm like, I got to get this guy on the show. I got to meet this guy. So I have been looking forward to this conversation for a couple of weeks now. So don't let me down, is basically what I'm trying to say.
Hey, listen, I'm a 3 on the Enneagram, so I don't like to let people down. I like to succeed.
All right. Well, let's see how this goes. Me too. I have a strong 3 wings, so we'll find out if we match each other's expectations. So on that note, let's begin. Before we jump into talking about the book and Modern Elder Academy, when and where did you first learn about the Enneagram, and how did it affect you?
So when I was in my early 20s, I was in therapy, and my therapist in the East Bay of San Francisco, like Berkeley area, and my therapist just said to me, "You know what? You're a 3 with a 4 wing." And I was like, "I have no idea what you're talking about." And she said to me, "There's this woman, Helen Palmer, who's based here in Berkeley, and she has a 12-week course coming up on the Enneagram." And of course, I had a hard time pronouncing Enneagram. People mispronounce it all the time. And so I got 40 years ago, got to learn from Helen Palmer directly in her living room. And that's how it all started. And thank God, because, if you are a 3, if I am a 3, to be able in my early 20s to understand my personality structure, recognize that I wanted to be much more than a surface person and a person who's just focused on succeeding and performing, was really helpful for me. And knowing that I was a 4 wing helped as well, because in some ways the 4 wing allows me to be original, emotional, artistic, and impractical. Whereas my 3 wing has my 3 core tends to be very practical.
Now, I'm a 4 with a 3 wing, although now in the second half of life, I'm much more of a 5 wing than I ever was, right? Like my other wing has definitely blossomed in the last 15 years. But did you ever find that your 3 and 4 wing get into inner arguments inside you?
All the time. I mean, and that's the beauty of it. That's the beauty of it, is to know that. I mean, I also have a strong 2. I was in the hospitality business forever, and therefore, I had really 2 tendencies: people pleasing, wanting to make people happy, very empathetic. But what the 4 did for me with the 3 is it helped me to see the beauty in life.
Mm-hmm.
As a 3, my tendency is to move very quickly. There's a beautiful African proverb: if you want to go far, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I'm a fast, go alone kind of person in many ways. And when you're going fast, you don't have time for curiosity, beauty, awe. And the 4 allows me to have the curiosity, beauty, and awe. And so my life is much more full as a result of that.
It's funny. Actually, the bulk of my work is in the corporate space. Whenever I go to do large workshops for companies, inevitably there are fewer 4s than any other type. In fact, in many industries, there are no 4s. Absolutely. I'll have 200 people in the room, no 4s. I'll have 100 3s. I'll have a million 8s. I'll have whatever, depending on the industry. If I'm in California, there's a lot of 7s floating around too.
Yes.
It seems to me that one of the beauties or one of the natural fits for you, having been in the hospitality space, is that 4s have a very attuned sense of aesthetics. They love to curate environments. And in fact, it's very natural, I would imagine, at the Modern Elder Academy, where you're really a curator, right? You're convening people, and you're creating environments and containers in which people can discover meaningful, life-changing truths about themselves and about life. And I bet that you're just very happy, even at times, to stand in the back of the room and just observe and just delight in that.
Very much so. And being a boutique hotelier, all the more that it's like the hotelier was the 2 in me. The boutique hotelier, more design oriented, more focused on the food and beverage restaurant operation, that was the 4. And then I was just a hyperachiever, the 3. And so it was a pretty good combination, quite frankly. But I think the 2 and the 4 really balanced it out. But yet, yes, I'm if I could show you the room I'm in right now at our Santa Fe campus, and you would find it pretty exquisite. So yeah, I mean, I think the bigger part for me is the 4 is less linear, and that's really the key. The less linear helps me with my 3, because my 3 can be very linear. It can be like, okay, where's the finish line? Let's go run. And the 4 helps me to say, like, wait, are you running on the right path? So.
And like, if you think about and how Helen Palmer would talk about focus of attention. And I think different types have different foci, right? So in other words, 3s tend to have laser-like focus, right? Very, very focused. On the other hand, 4s, 9s, and other types have more diffuse attention, right? It sort of takes in the whole, right? And so for you to have access to both of those things is pretty great. Pretty great. Yeah,
Thank you.
pretty wonderful. So I want to talk about the first and second half of life, because Anthony will tell you that I spend a lot of time talking, thinking, and dwelling on this. And over the years, I've been very influenced by James Hollis, by James Hillman, by lots of people, Carl Jung, lots of the people that I'm sure you have been as well. I see you smiling.
I can't wait to hang out with you in person.
I'm telling you, when I read your books, I was like, this guy and I could have a lot of conversations. So I want to talk about the first and second half of life. I want to talk about it through the lens of an Enneagram 3. But let's begin by just saying, how would you characterize the difference between the first and second halves of life, or between the tasks of the first half of life, and then as we transition to midlife and beyond?
Well, as Richard Rohr, who just taught here at our Santa Fe campus a month ago, has suggested the first half of life, you're creating the container,
Mm-hmm.
and that container is your identity, and the variety of identities you have, but the way you show up in the world. And your ego is sort of the primary operating system.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second half of your life, it's about filling the container and filling. And so it's not about just the surface, the surface container that sort of allows it to be contained, but it is
Mm-hmm.
actually the what's inside. And so, I think the first half of life is about the primary operating system being the ego, and the second half of life, it's the primary operating system is the soul. It doesn't mean that you don't have the soul in the first half of life, or you don't have the ego in the second half of life. But I went to ballroom dancing school when I was in sixth grade, and the boys lead the girls. And it's like the ego's leading the soul. But in the second half of life, it's like the soul is leading the ego. And so the ego is having to learn how to dance backwards in heels. And the ego is not used to that. So the ego better have a sense of humor to be able to handle that. I also think another thing about the first half and the second half of life is the first half of life is about accumulating, and the second half of life is about editing. And that's an alternative way to look at it, quite simply. And I think when you see people downsize when they become empty nesters, that's a form of editing. When you see people get clearer on what's important to them in their 50s and beyond, that's editing. When people get clear on who they want to spend their time with as they get older, that's editing. And there's also something to be said for there's a lot of people, the majority of people who actually change their social way of being, introversion, extroversion. 2/3 of the people, if they change, not everybody does change, but if they do change from extrovert to introvert or from introvert to extrovert, 2/3 of those changes in midlife and beyond are extrovert to introvert, as opposed to introvert to extrovert. And in that case, what that's also suggesting is you're going a little more internal. And so, I could keep talking about this forever. And all of those people you've mentioned have been guides to me and to our Modern Elder Academy curriculum. And part of the reason we created MEA was because, gosh, there was no midlife wisdom school. There was no place where people could go in their 40s, 50s, 60s, or beyond to actually reimagine and repurpose themselves and consciously curate the second half of their life. So
Yes.
we have, I'll tell you more as you ask more questions.
Well, no, I love, a friend of Richard's is a guy named Ronald Rollheiser. And Ronald oftentimes talks about, he uses actually a New Testament metaphor, as Richard often does, right? Like the first half of life is about this passage in the New Testament about the parable of the talents, where these talents are buried underground and you have to bring them to the surface and make dividends on them. But the second half of life is far more about the prodigal story, right? It's about the more soulish agenda of forgiveness, of making peace, and I would say of individuation, right? Of maybe another way to frame it would be like the first half of life is about, in many ways, the unconscious construction of a false self. And the second half of life, and I think actually this is a quote from your book, is about the reclaiming of the true self.
Yeah. Well, I think that's exactly what's happening. And I'm not, sometimes, the false self is language that I sometimes use. And obviously it comes from Jung and others. I don't love the language because I actually think it is it's the first half of life self. And that first half of life self often is directed toward a success script that you've been handed when you were 10 years old, and you are living out that successism script. So consumerism is a word that's 70 years old, speaks to the idea of keeping up with the Joneses. Successism is a relatively new concept, and it's based upon the premise that the community or family definition of success can be oppressive to you. It can be defined, you are defined by it and then oppressed by it. And your job is to release yourself from it. Just like consumerism is about something you release yourself from, as you get older, probably, because you realize that experiences are more important than things. And so similarly, I think for many people, they around midlife are realizing, what really is important to them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where they go to the true self as opposed to the false self. But false self feels like the first half of your life can be negated as a result of that. And that's why I struggle with the word false, because I actually think I'll have to think of an alternative language for that. But it's almost like it's the self that has been co-created with your community, as opposed to the self you've created yourself on your own. And that's a big shift. And I think individuation is something that happens when we're kids from our parents, but we have an imprint on us. So we individuate and realize, okay, and the individuation is part of the ego structure that's been being developed. But when you mentioned a couple minutes ago that you individuate in the second half of your life, it's funny. I think you do individuate. You actually become more to your true self, but you also become more connected with the rest of the world. And that's the
Mm-hmm.
part that I think is really interesting
Mm.
when we move out of the ghetto of the ego and the sense that the whole world revolves around us. And that's also when we can start appreciating beauty and awe in new ways, because we see the oneness of everything and how it all
Yes.
connects.
Yes. So, but this is a very germane conversation for a 3, right? Because if the Enneagram is true enough, then for Enneagram 3s, that first half of life, in many ways, you could say that for whatever reason, many Enneagram 3s report that they had an experience growing up where success expectations were either foisted on them or in a real or perceived way. They took them on.
Yeah.
They ran hard to win the approval of a million ungraduated ghosts in the closet. They construct selves to win the approval or match the expectations of others. So, in many ways, what's hard for 3s is, a lot of people, how do I want to say this? It's like you get stroked for being a really successful 3. Right? Like you get a lot of applause, especially like in Western culture. It's like, oh my gosh, you're a success and you've killed it and you're so charming and so wonderful and blah 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 and you're so socially confident and adept, etc., charismatic, that it's hard to start doing the inner work because you've been so stroked for so long in the first half of life for just continuing on in the game, right? So what happened to you that you had? Was there a moment of awakening where it's like, I am not living the life that is truly mine, or I've not yet reclaimed the true self? Like, because I think a lot of 3s can get pretty old before they wake up, if they wake up.
Yeah. My first mentee is a guy named Gavin Newsom, and I've been his mentor for 30 years now. And he is a classic 3 he's great in many ways. And because he got stroked at such a young age for being the good-looking athlete, smart guy, and ultimately politician and entrepreneur, then politician, he's had a hard time like doing the inner work, because especially if you're someone who's in the public eye, and
Mm-hmm.
then you have to keep up that facade.
Yes.
And I say this out of all kinds of love and care for Gavin, but he's a good example of somebody who I actually think would be a more effective and successful politician today if he actually embodied that inner side of the 3. So for me, I was Stephen Townsend Conley Jr. I was the only son of 2 parents. I had 2 parents who were firstborns. I was the firstborn. I had 2 younger sisters. My job was to be a better version of my dad. And my dad was a Marine captain, went to the same high school. My dad was a baseball coach. I was the star pitcher. My dad was in Boy Scouts with me. He was an Eagle Scout. I became an Eagle Scout. I went to the same high school as my dad, played the same 2 sports as my dad, went to Stanford just like my dad, joined a fraternity. I didn't join his fraternity, but I joined my fraternity. But it was, and I played water polo at Stanford like my dad. And it really wasn't until I was 22 years old when I came out as a gay man, which was a really hard thing to do back then. It was 1983, the height of the AIDS fears, and a time where, this being gay was a pretty big time mark on your career record, a lot of things. And I had to come to grips with the fact that this is who I really was. And that process through therapy, that process through working with Helen Palmer, I think just was, for many people, they might say like, being gay is like a curse. For me, it was actually sort of an awakening. And not that I define my whole life by that, I don't, but it was this opening of a door that forced me to look within and forced me to be an original, which is the four part of me, as opposed to, being on the traditional US definition of success, like how it all looks together. So yeah, I mean, I hope you don't mind me being so open about that, but it really is, I think, what led me to being an embodied 3 who knew what it was like inside, as opposed to just how I was portraying it outside. And today, I mean, one of the things, I'll just say one last thing, being a writer, being a leader in business for a long time and having a lot of success, it's been really beautiful for me to actually be a 3 and be a version of a 3 that really likes to go deep and within and is very open to being vulnerable and candid, because it's unusual. So it's unusual that a 3 has that quality about them, but it was forged in my early 20s.
Typology Podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp.
As summer winds down and kids return to school, I'm reminded of the ways children are always learning and growing. But as adults, we can get caught up in the day-to-day and sometimes lose that curiosity. Don't you think so, Anthony?
Oh, 100%. As a songwriter, I'm always trying to grow in my curiosity and wonder.
For me, I'm constantly striving to learn new things and keep growing myself. For instance, I'm an avid reader and challenge myself to explore different topics, whether that's keeping current with the news or learning more about how our minds work or immersing myself in spiritual teachings. It's important for me to make time to actively engage my curiosity. Now listen, a good therapist can help you reconnect with that sense of wonder and curiosity that so many of us lose when we become adults. That's why I encourage everyone to give therapy a try. You don't have to be battling a major trauma. Therapy is for everyone. And with BetterHelp Online Therapy, you can schedule video, phone, or even live chat sessions with your therapist when it's convenient for you. I encourage you to rediscover your curiosity with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/typologypodcast today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/typologypodcast. First of all, openness is and vulnerability are so welcome on this show. They're hallmark features of everything that we're about. So all of you is welcome here.
Thank you.
And the thing that strikes me as you're speaking is that sometimes, do you think that, and I think Richard says this, that we tend to think of the first half of life as in chronologically, like it's like 0 to 45, right? And then 45 to 90 is the second half. But that's actually sort of a false dichotomy, right?
Yep. Yeah. I mean, listen, in my new book, Learning to Love Midlife, I talk about midlife having 40 years attached to it, 35 to 75, which a lot of sociologists now believe is true. And there's an early midlife, 35 to 50, a core of midlife, 50 to 60, and then a later midlife, 60 to 75. There are a lot of ways to partition up a life, and they're all generally pretty academic and there's sort of some definitions that may or may not work, but what I do know is that there are, in your life stages, around 45 to 50 is a period of time. It's the lowest point on the U curve of happiness. It's a time when people, the suicide rate and Antidepressant use is at its peak for people in adulthood. So there's something going on. And I think, for a lot of people, and you're going through a lot of transitions at that stage. Women may be going through menopause, and there could be divorce, and your parents you got a sandwich generation thing going on, empty nest, etc. But we really don't have any rites of passage or rituals to help people in that period of life. And that's really why MEA was created, was because what we saw is that you're going through as many transitions in midlife, as you are in adolescence, your teen years. Both eras are full of transitions. But adolescents, albeit today, adolescents are not very happy, but adolescents have a lot of social infrastructure supporting them. Scouting programs, sporting programs, school, parents, school counselors, college counselors. There's a lot going on, and there's a lot of support. The social support the infrastructure is there. But when you're going through adolescence or midlife, there is no social infrastructure. You're not going through it with a pod or with a class of people. You're not having first kisses like you are at age 14 with your best friends. You're going through this stuff feeling alone, especially men, because men are not nearly as good at forging vulnerable relationships with each other. And we end up getting into this place where people in their midlife and their adolescence feel like they're getting the game of life wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really why I lost 5 male friends to suicide, age 42 to 52, during the Great Recession. And because I did, and I was struggling with my own life at that same time, I just realized, my God, we do need a place for people in midlife to reframe their relationship with aging, navigate their transitions, cultivate purpose, and learn how to own their wisdom. Because, one of the beauties of getting older is you do have wisdom, but nobody taught you how to metabolize it. So that's what we do. We help with all that.
Yes. And I love how Arthur Brooks talks about this in his latest book. And I saw that he endorsed this book. And I was a fan of that book, with the title, From Strength to Strength.
From Strength
right?
to Strength, yeah.
Right. Which I commend to people as well. I really enjoyed that book as well. But the idea of crystalline knowledge that you have in the second half of life. What was the first half? Fluid
Intelligence. You're fast and focused.
Mm-hmm.
Crystallized intelligence is you think more systemically and holistically and connecting the dots. As you were talking about earlier, the 4 or the 9 are sort of a crystallized intelligence way of looking at the world.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas a 3 or an 8 might be a little more fast and focused in how they do things.
Mm-hmm. So what do you see as the biggest challenge for people transitioning into the modern elder phase of life, specifically maybe even for 3s?
Well, I think generally speaking, we in the U.S. have a very ageist culture, and not because there's some nefarious, point of view to beat up on the old people, but it's just been like that for decades. Hollywood had a lot to do with it. The move from the agricultural to the industrial economy to the technology economy had something to do with it. And so for a lot of people, getting older means you're getting closer to death. It means you're more focused on loss than gain. Loss meaning your physical loss, your beauty, your brawn, your short-term memory. And there are a lot of things that get worse with age. But part of the reason I wrote Learning to Love Midlife was because the subtitle says it all, the 12 reasons why life gets better with age. And I wanted to point out what are the things that do get better with age, like emotional intelligence or wisdom, the ability to tell your own narrative about who you are, your ability to edit things, your ability to get off the treadmill and maybe create some time affluence for yourself, moving from ego to the soul, learning how to become whole in terms of how you see yourself as opposed to compartmentalized. I mean, there's a lot of things that get better with age, and I really wanted to amplify that. In terms of 3s and getting older, if a 3 is very focused on the athleticism, that kind of performance of a 3, yeah, it's hard. That's hard. Or if it's a 3, very image conscious man or woman who likes to look good in public, that can be hard. I mean, I would guess 3s are the number one type to get Botox or plastic surgery degree or something like that. And I say that having had none of that. I have zero desire to do that because in many ways I have come to realize that my body is like a rental vehicle I was issued at birth. And my job in the first half of life was to make sure the rental vehicle looked really good, make sure I was buffing it out and no dents. And in the second half of my life, it's no longer about what it looks like on the outside. It's what it feels like on the inside. And, so I have this rental vehicle for me. I care about how I look, but it's more about less about the short-term vanity and more about the long-term maintenance of this vehicle.
Man, I appreciate that. We just spent the last year, and I was writing a new book, and we went to Mexico for 9 months.
Where
we
were
lived
you?
up in San Miguel de Allende.
Oh, one of my favorite places in the world.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Oh man. Well, we just got back 4 months ago from being there for 9 months. I was, like I said, working on a new book. But prior to that, I had written a book called The Story of You. And The Story of You is a narrative. It was me taking narrative therapy, combining it with the Enneagram, and sort of positing this idea that, all of us tell a story to ourselves and to others about who we are and how we think the world works. Right.
Yeah.
And what we don't realize, and that's why you keep using the word edit, which I love, because I do believe we are the stories that we tell ourselves and others about who we are. And so much of individuation or differentiation really is about the journey of realizing, oh, wait a minute, I have some agency here about what story I choose to tell about my life and about my history and about who I am. So what is the new narrative you tell yourself now these days about who you are and about what life means to you?
So we do a whole bunch of exercises here at MEA that help people to find that little kernel of their gift and what they have to offer the world. There's a beautiful David Viscott quote, which is, the purpose of life is to discover your gift. The work of life is to develop it. And the meaning of life is to give it away. So part of what we help people with is discovering their gift, learning how to develop it, and then how do you give it away? For me, I am a social alchemist. I am a mixologist of people. I blend a good drink when it comes to not alcohol necessarily, although I can do that, but in terms of, setting a table with the right people or setting up a conversation in a workshop with a question that knocks your socks off and creates a life-changing conversation. So that is where I am in my life today. I was very focused on ROI, return on investment, most of my life at my boutique hotel company, Joie de Vivre, as well as 7.5 years that I was helping the founders run their company at Airbnb. And I've moved away from that kind of ROI to ripples of impact ROI. Or as Eric Erickson would say, I am what survives me, which is what he talked about in the 7th of the 8th life stages that he outlined. And this idea of generativity, a word used earlier, as versus stagnation. So I'm in a very generative time in my life. And that means I have a lot flowing through me. I'm no longer the can-do-it hero. I'm the conduit. Things come through me. But earlier in my life, as a 3, very much can-do-it hero. Going from can-do-it to conduit is really interesting. I love the language on that. And I really appreciate that, with stage 3 cancer, prostate cancer that spread to my lymphs, I don't know how long I'm going to live, and I never did. And I had an NDE experience. I died at age 47, an allergic reaction to an antibiotic. So I had a wake up call in the middle of my midlife that taught me to say, like, how do I want to curate my life? And I have to ask that all the time. So long story short is I am lucky enough to have had that coming out experience in my 20s, that dying experience at 47, learning I had cancer 6 years ago and living with cancer, but also having all kinds of treatments to give me a sense that my role in life is to be in this moment and to be fully in the sense of immediacy of what's happening right now. And when I do that, I find myself to be happier and more energized, and I don't get weighed down with the past or the future.
You as you were talking earlier about the conduit to a conduit, I was thinking about someone years ago. I never really quite understood what I did for a living, right? I was a therapist, so I was a trained therapist. I was an Episcopal priest, so I had that training. I was an author. I was a speaker. I had been a songwriter in Nashville. So I had all these weird hats, and like I always said to my kids, what do you tell your friends at school when they ask what your dad does for a living? They're like, it's kind of hard. And so I reached out to a friend of mine and I said, listen, do me a favor. I've always wanted to have a business card. And I said, but I'm not one of those guys who has business cards, right? So I said, could you tell me, what would you put on my business card? Now, this is a person who had been to a bunch of my retreats and done stuff with me and read my books, blah, blah, blah. And she wrote back and she just wrote this quote by Robert Frost, which you know very well, right? Which is, I am not a teacher, but an awakener.
Mm.
And that's what I sense that you are, right? That you create environments in which people can awaken, and it's born out of some personal suffering, right? I think awakeners, and I do think of myself in that category, although I sort of kind of grimace when I say that because it sounds very self-congratulatory. But of all the words that ever describe what I did for a living, at least I sought to be an awakener. That was my goal, right? To create experiences or moments in which awakenings happen. And when you see the lights go on in someone else's eyes and you realize you have made some meaningful connection for them or facilitated a moment of connection for them, that they just had this sort of like, head blasting moment, then I felt like, okay, there's not enough money in the world you can pay me for that. That's just, it's like, that is the best currency in the world is to watch that moment. And I'm sensing that you're that kind of a person as well.
Yeah. The idea of awakening yourself and others is, to me, like, maybe the ultimate noble profession. There's a nobility in that. And yeah, I appreciate you bringing up that quote. I've never heard that Robert Frost quote, so I'm gonna go steal it and give him credit. We are in a slumber for much of our lives, and I say that partly because I just see so many people in that state of stuckness. And it may not even look like stuckness. Some people are obvious in their stuckness and they're struggling and it's apparent to everybody. But for some people, the stuckness is actually inside. It's not visibly outside. And the stuckness is habitual. There's a guy named Malidoma Some, an African shaman who's written some beautiful books. He just passed away. He talked about the difference between routine and ritual. And a lot of people are in routine.
Yes.
But ritual, the difference is, in a ritual, according to Malidoma, in a ritual, you are willing to be altered by the ritual.
Ooh.
And that's a huge difference. And so we are in lives that are meant for efficiency purposes because we pray to the God of efficiency and habituality to stay in our lane. And, if you're an awakener, you utilize either obvious ritual or not obvious ritual, but something that is the catalyst for you to be altered. And I think we all could use that. And I'm not somebody who goes into psychedelics or things like that. That's another form of altered states. And I have done them, but I actually also think sometimes people become like too reliant on that form of alteration. The alteration could be an awakening to God, spirit. There's all kinds of ways to be awakened.
Yes.
I do think this whole, without getting too political, this idea like woke. Woke is this word that got created. It actually goes way back to African-American times in the 1950s and 60s. But then it got sort of taken over by the left and the progressives. And then there's like the anti-woke. But anti-woke means you're asleep. And I don't think that, so I'm not here to say that woke is good or woke is bad, but I will say that being asleep is something you need in life. and we all need it, and it's good. But being asleep all the time in your life is how a lot of people live. And so therefore you're an awakener to help people come out of their slumber. So
Yes. Yes, and I think what you're describing. There's a great Jesuit priest many years ago. I'm sure you know him, Anthony de Mello. And de Mello
yeah,
used to say that he said, this is a direct quote. He said, "Spirituality is about waking up." And I love that because I think and I think that's what the Enneagram is. Like I'm one of these guys, by the way, who doesn't think the Enneagram is a religion. I just think the Enneagram is a
it's a
useful,
tool.
interesting tool
Yeah.
that, you ought to have on your belt, something that gives you a layer of self-discovery and self-knowledge that can help you mitigate the downside of all your habitual, predictable patterns of acting, thinking, and feeling that don't serve you very well, right?
Yep. Yep.
And but I do think that whether we do it, and there are lots of tools like this that can help us identify routinized patterns of behavior that throw us into this perpetual spiritual torpor. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You remember, Anthony, do you remember watching Scooby-Doo as a kid, the cartoon
Of
Scooby-Doo?
course.
Do you remember, trust me, this is going somewhere. So do you remember how he used to, like, whenever he smelled food, he'd put his arms out like he was in a trance, and he would just start chasing the food, like his eyes would get glazed over, right? And I swear to you, I think that's how most people go through life, right? They're kind of like just in a trance-like state. And it's in the trance of their kind of routine or routinized internal patterns, the stories, they're just they're hypnotized by the stories, they're the narratives in their head, and they're just going along. And I think awakening, in the religious sense of the word and the psychological sense of the word, is when we are thrown back on our heels and we finally see, like, we have ears to hear, we have eyes to see, and suddenly we see the possibility of a life that is free of those patterns and stories that then lead us toward what I think, Chip, you talk so much about in your new book, which is about, moving toward wholeness in life, right? Which I love the idea that, that's the game, man. It's like moving toward a sense of union with yourself and with the world.
Yeah, and let's talk about what that means. So we do grow old, but we also grow whole if we're
Mm-hmm.
living a good life. And what does it mean to grow whole? It means that we're alchemists. We are introvert and extrovert. We are curious and wise. We have gravitas and levity. Gravitas, depth, levity, lightness, and humor. We have masculine and feminine qualities. We are not so compartmentalized. And when you meet somebody who's 80 years old and seemingly very wise, I think the first thing you notice typically is that they're very present. And in being very present, it doesn't feel like they're sort of distracted. It feels like they're just wholly here in this moment. And they embody all of those alchemies within themselves, those polarities within themselves. And, I wish we could do that for American society right now, because we are so polarized in so many ways. And being able to alchemize those polarities in a healthy way is, I think, what American society could use right now. But I think people who do that for themselves is the first step.
Well, Chip, this has been a remarkable conversation, my friend. I feel like I'm out over my skis. When you're in a conversation with somebody, and I knew this was going to happen after I read your books, right? Yeah. You have not disappointed. Because sometimes I read people's books and I fall in love with them, and I'm like, I meet them and I'm like, oh, that didn't work out so well.
Well,
and
they're just repeating the same old crap. I mean, like, yeah. they don't have anything else to say.
But you have confirmed what I suspected in my heart, which was that I was going to love this conversation.
Oh, thank you.
And that feeling when on the inside, somatically, you feel like you're out over your skis because you just have so much. Your speech is starting to get pressured because you just have so much you want to share because you feel like, oh, yeah, I know you're going to like this because you probably read this guy or you love this.
Well, why don't you come and co-lead a workshop with me at MEA? I mean,
I would love it. I would love that. Be careful. Don't let my heart down. Don't let me down.
No.
Okay?
Send me an email, and your publicist can connect us, and let's plan on doing a workshop together, because the kinds of things we've just talked about here today are the kinds of things that we talk about every single day of the year at both of our campuses. But there are very few faculty members that we currently have that have the kind of depth of knowledge on these topics that you have. So, and especially, I grew up as an Episcopalian. I have a real respect for people who come, are from the cloth.
Oh, well, I would love to do it. It would be a blast. And I think I would actually feel like I was coming alive in that community, because I can tell from getting all your emails and reading your books. And again, we are talking about the book, Learning to Love Midlife, 12 Reasons Why Life Gets Better with Age, by my new friend. And actually, he was my friend before he got on the show, because I make friends with authors, as people do, right?
Yeah.
Chip Conley. Chip, thank you so much. I want to tell everybody you can go to chipconley.com, right?
Yep.
And check that out. You need to get over to Modern Elder Academy, MEA, and that's MEA.com. Is that what that is?
It's just MEAwisdom.com.
MEAwisdom.com to check out just the amazing stuff you're doing on this wonderful frontier that you're forging through. Really, it's wonderful. Anthony, as always, I love you, brother.
Love you, man. Thanks. It's good to be with you, Chip.
Yeah, Anthony, thank you.
And to all of you listening, may you have love, may you have joy, may you have peace, may you have healing, and may you have rest. Until next time.